This is the Read to Lead podcast, episode 102.
Hi, I'm Clay Clark, author of Thrive, How to Take Control of Your Destiny and Move Beyond Surviving Now. You've taken a crucial first step by listening to this. It's the Read to Lead podcast with my friend, Jeff Brown.
Society often sees introverts as people who want to hide, who don't want to be seen or heard. And all of those images and then the words that accompany them make us small.
Welcome to the Read to Lead podcast with Jeff Brown. Jeff believes that if you desire to achieve true success in business and in life, then consistent and intentional reading is a must. The Read to Lead podcast will not only help you narrow this ever important reading list, but also bring you key insights and valuable feedback from some of today's most successful and inspiring authors. And now, here's Jeff.
Hello and welcome to the podcast dedicated to your personal and professional growth, where I sit down with a successful and inspiring author each week. We talk about their latest book and their thoughts on things like leadership, personal development, productivity, career, marketing, business, and entrepreneurship. In today's episode, we'll be chatting with Beth Below, who is the author of The Introvert Entrepreneur, Amplify Your Strengths and Create Success on Your Own Terms. Some of the things I'll be asking Beth about include some of the misconceptions society has about introverts, tips for communicating with the introverts in your life, the introvert's relationship with fear, and much more. If you're serious about taking a stand for your health, I want to encourage you to consider adding a motorized desk to your work or home office. That's what I've done, and I will never, ever go back to a regular old desk again. The great thing about a motorized desk, of course, is I can stand and sit as I need to throughout the day, and I'm not doing what so many studies today are telling us we're doing when we're sitting down so often, is slowly killing ourselves. My recommendation is the Power Up desk from the folks at UpDesk. It's what I use, and I highly recommend it. You can find out more about it at readtoleadpodcast.com/desk. Beth Below is a certified coach, a corporate trainer, and professional speaker, and since founding her company, The Introvert Entrepreneur, in 2010, along with her popular podcast of the same name, she's established herself as a go-to expert for introvert entrepreneurs around the world. She is also the author of the book, and I'm sensing a theme, The Introvert Entrepreneur, Amplify Your Strengths and Create Success on Your Own Terms. Beth, how the heck are you?
I'm great, and clearly I'm consistent.
Yes, I love that about you. And I've had no less than two guests recommend Beth be interviewed for this show. I want to say thanks to Erica Dewan from episode 72 for making the introduction. But not to be outdone, Rory Vaden came right behind her and said, "You need to interview Beth."
I am so grateful to Erica and Rory. Yes, thank you to them. Two awesome people with awesome books. So it's great to be connected with you.
Well, likewise. And I have never had that happen in 102 episodes of the podcast. And so the bar is set pretty high.
No pressure.
No pressure. If this doesn't go well, we know exactly who to blame, right?
Exactly.
No, just kidding. Well, Beth, I know you have poured your heart into this book, and it's been a labor of love. So, Introvert Entrepreneur, why was this book necessary in your view?
What I've noticed as I've entered into the entrepreneurial realm is that there's something of a gap in the information that's been available. At least there was when I started in 2010. As I looked at various resources out there, whether they were books or blogs or podcasts, everything kind of, if not overtly, but, subversively, had kind of an extrovert bent. There's a lot of messages out there about, bigger, better, faster, more. And a lot of the emphasis on entrepreneurship has to do with your sales, networking and sales. And I was finding that a lot of the information just did not resonate. And I realized that part of that was because of, among many things, of course, there are lots of factors that are involved, but among them had to do with energy, where I gain and drain my energy and being an introvert and having a certain response to those more extroverted messages. I just wasn't fine. I didn't find what I was looking for. And And as I worked with clients, I realized that they weren't finding what they were looking for either. So it seemed like there was this perfect opportunity, this perfect opening in the universe to be able to step in and look at things from an introvert perspective and be able to speak to those who wanted to have a different way of approaching their business.
And to that end, a lot of what's already out there is about the research and the statistics, and that's all well and good. But how is your book different in approaching this topic?
Well, once I started looking at business and entrepreneurship through an introvert lens, I realized, it's not a statistical exercise. It's not an intellectual thing, but it's really a mind, body, spirit kind of perspective. And I've always known that I was going to write a book, for one thing, but I always knew that it was going to be kind of conversational in tone. And since I'm a coach, it's very coachy in tone, I have to admit. I'm not an academician, or if I'm saying that right, or researcher. Although I love research, I wanted to create something that was very practical and could be something that you could refer to for not just information, but inspiration, that it would provide a grounding for you. And so since it's got that coaching perspective, it offers up questions and reflection and stories and invites the reader to come to some of their own conclusions. So there are plenty of resources and timely resources. A book is, I think it's already dated once it's printed, right? And if you include statistics and research, they're already out of date. Yeah. So, I would encourage people to go to magazines and webs and, blog posts and podcasts and whatnot if they want to stay current on those kinds of things. But I wanted to create something that was going to, last a while from that perspective.
Yeah, sort of evergreen, isn't it?
Exactly.
Well, as someone who does a bit of coaching, mostly in the podcasting space, I have found a lot from the book that I can apply to what I'm doing. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
What would you say are some of the misconceptions or misperceptions society perpetuates about entrepreneurs? Or I'm sorry, about introverts.
And entrepreneurs to some degree. But I think introverts take the hit a little bit harder. As I said, I started this back in 2010. And so when I began, I started wondering, how are introverts being portrayed out in the media? What are the images? What are the words that are being used? I knew in my gut that there was a negative perception. There's a little bit of suspicion about anyone who likes to be alone too much or is a little bit more on the quiet side or only quote unquote has 5 friends instead of 50. And one of the first things I did was I went to iStock and started looking at stock photos, and I typed in the word introvert. And of course, it immediately substituted it with shy. And then it's like, did you mean shy? and all of the images were of people hiding with bags over their heads, hiding behind books, looking downcast, looking depressed.
Interesting.
And I think that's a reflection of how society often sees introverts as people who want to hide, who don't want to be seen or heard. And all of those images and then the words that accompany them make us small. They diminish what it really means to be an introvert, and they misconstrue what it means. Because as we've come to know, and actually the information's been out there for a long time, but I think we're finally coming around to moving past the stereotypes into more of the truth, which is that it's not about personality per se. It's about energy. It's about where you gain and drain your energy. And of course, that impacts how you show up socially. But it's not part of the intrinsic definition.
What would you say then are the advantages to being an introvert, or are there advantages?
I think there are. And, I'm very sensitive as we're talking about introverts and extroverts and advantages and disadvantages, to be aware that it's not about comparing and, this type is better than this type, or this is good or this is bad. I like to think of them as simply different because they're all on a spectrum. And so with that spirit, there are a few things that I do think that introverts that are strengths that they don't realize are strengths. One of them is that they are internal processors. And that often means that they are taking in information and connecting dots that other people might not see because they're busy trying to absorb a lot of stuff and allowing overstimulation to kind of take over. And instead, an introvert is going to take information and then step away from all of that stimulation and see where they can, put it together in a way that maybe somebody hasn't thought of before. And that is I think is a powerful skill and trait when it comes to, especially to innovation and imagination and being creative. And I think another piece that is important, whether you're for entrepreneurs and especially for leaders, is something that I talk about in the book a few times, which is tying back to the work of Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great. And he talks about level 5 leadership. So level 5 leaders are those that led the good to great companies. And the words that he uses to describe those leaders tend to be more introvert friendly words. So being reflective, working behind the scenes, being the plow horse as opposed to the show horse, deflecting credit and taking responsibility. And one of the things that he talks about is the liability of charisma. When you have a larger than life leader, whether that's an entrepreneur leading a company or a leader within an organization, if there's any sort of cult of personality around that person, or there's that perception that they are kind of infallible and not approachable, then that can lead to that liability of charisma where having that charisma actually works against you because people are less likely to come to you with the truth or to challenge your thinking. And it's not that introverts don't show charisma. I don't want to, make it sound like we are not charismatic, but our charisma is a little bit, it's different. It is maybe perhaps a little bit more reserved, a little more behind the scenes, a little more listening as opposed to talking. And that often creates an environment that's a little safer for people to approach that leader and say, I have a question about this, or I'm not so sure that this is the right way to go, or I have another idea. The energy of an introvert, if harnessed in a healthy way, can be something that is very receptive to those kinds of conversations and therefore helps you to avoid other problems that might come up because people don't speak up.
You hinted a bit at this propensity for reflection. How can we tell the difference between what is true, sincere reflection and what might instead be I think it's what you call paralysis analysis?
Right. Yeah, introverts do tend to be introspective and reflective, and because of that, it can tip the scale into the unhealthy side of analysis or paralysis by analysis, where we're overthinking and overdoing something. I see the difference as sincere reflection is really coming from a place of power, of strength, and from love. So there's really a clear intention to find the truth. And there's a belief that whatever comes of that reflection is going to be useful. So it's coming from true curiosity, like a comfort with not knowing what the answer is, rather than a struggle to try to find the perfect answer. And so to that end, I think of paralysis by analysis as being more fear-based. So it's going over thoughts over and over and over again and getting trapped in a need for perfection or attachment to a particular outcome. So one is more based in, love and curiosity, and the other is based more in kind of fear and playing around with the hamster wheel a little bit more.
And I want to dig into fear just a little bit. I want to kind of camp there for a moment. There's this point in the book, I think it's in chapter 2, where you talk about the amount of fear we feel isn't directly related to whether we're an introvert or extrovert. You say what's different is our relationship to fear. What do you mean by that exactly?
It has to do with how we absorb the information, how we absorb the fear. If I'm feeling fear about something in my business, I'm more likely to get on that hamster wheel and turn it over and over and over again and kind of get caught up in making stories up in my mind. And I was having a conversation with someone else a few days ago, and he, when I explained this to him, he said, "Oh, so it's like mold. Mold grows in the dark," right? And so when we keep those fears in the dark inside of us as introverts, they spread like mold, and it's really hard to get rid of it. And so what the key is, and this is a place where I invite introverts to extrovert, to learn to and get comfortable with projecting some of those thoughts outward, because it's like mold. Once you start to expose it to light, it shrinks. You can start to deal with it. You see what you've got and you can chip away at it.
There's this story in the book that Beth shares about attending a conference where many of the speakers, sort of the common thread was this idea of being fearless, hinting at the idea that you could slay these fears once and for all. But Beth, you talk about the flaw of being fearless. Share a bit about that and what you mean by that.
One of my favorite books, and one of the ones that I think I can trace it back to being the first self-help book I read, was Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway by Susan Jeffers. And it's an oldie but a goodie. And what that book did was it gave the reader permission to feel fear. It said, feeling fear is not a bad thing. It is not a sign of weakness. It's part of being human. And fear has valuable information for us. It tells us about what's important to us. It might be a red flag to something and saying, hey, pay attention. There might be danger ahead, but it doesn't mean don't proceed. So if we're told to be fearless, it's negating something that's very important about our journey and about the human condition, because it's simply a natural part of being alive, and it's inevitable if you're going to be doing something extraordinary, and even if you're going to be doing something ordinary, but it's new, to you. And so saying fearless doesn't honor that very human emotion.
You lay out the FUDs, fear, uncertainty, doubts, FUDs, I guess we would call them.
Yeah.
But talk about identifying those, how to go about that, and what steps we can take to transform them into useful information.
Yeah, I think what you want to do is notice where your thoughts are falling into assumptions and limiting beliefs. And, those fears, you can start to put a name on them, such as, that's an assumption. I'm assuming that if I charge too much, no one will want my services, for instance. When you hear yourself making those kinds of assumptions, and in the book, I offer, a few kind of key words and phrases that you might find popping up in your thoughts and in your speech that will help to identify those fears. When you start to hear them, that's an opportunity to challenge them. And I like to turn to a very simple question that Byron Katie introduced to us in her book, Loving What Is, which is simply, what's true? I find time and time again, anytime I ask that of my clients, anytime they ask that of themselves, it's like a light bulb goes off and they say, oh, okay. It's not so much that maybe it's not true, but it challenges it to the point where they can say, okay, is it true or is it not true? And if it is true, what am I going to do about that? If it's not true, then I can look at it, decide, okay, what's useful, what's not, what can I take away from that? What is true? What evidence is there that can support or refute that thought? So a lot of it is about checking for what's true. And then a lot of it is also discerning when it comes to those fears, whether you're feeling fear or discomfort.
There's a difference, isn't there? Yeah.
There's a difference. Fear is about fight or flight in many instances. And we've come to take that word and used it very generally. Like, I have lots of fears. And it's like, really? Do you have a lot of fight or flight responses? Or is it really about feeling discomfort or uncomfortable because you're about to do something that's going to stretch or take you, outside of your comfort zone? And for me, saying that I'm afraid of something has a lot more power than saying it makes me uncomfortable. Making me uncomfortable feels more like something that I can work through, something I can change. It's a little less scary. So really asking yourself, am I really afraid of this, or is it more about feeling discomfort?
Was it discomfort for you personally when you think about things like networking? Do you find that that's often the case with other introverts too? It's really not fear. They may think of it that way, but it's really, when it comes down to it, it's more of a discomfort than anything else.
Absolutely. And networking is a great example of that. We say we're afraid that we're not going to know what to say, or that we won't know how to introduce ourselves, or that people won't want to talk to us, or that we're bothering people. When really, as you say, it's more about a discomfort with the situation because it's not our natural habitat. And anytime you're outside of your natural habitat, it might be a little uncomfortable. And people, even extroverts, might feel uncomfortable in networking situations. The key is to remember that a lot of it has to do with skills and mindset. So if you can change your mindset and then figure out what skills you need to cultivate, then you realize that it doesn't matter introvert or extrovert. Anybody can be a superstar networker. You just have to get through that idea that it's not about, unless it truly is about fear, it's not about fear.
Well, it's hard to be an entrepreneur without sales coming into the equation. But what would you say to someone who says, "But I'm not a salesperson"? In fact, there's a chapter you title that, I think.
Yeah. Especially for introverts, to remember that sales is really about connecting a person who has a problem with a solution that you have to offer. Or even if you want to take it even broader and generalize it, you can say connecting a person with a solution. It may or may not be what you have to offer. And so you can go into it with a feeling of curiosity, with a lot of questions, a willingness to listen, and an intention to find the best solution for that person. If it ends up being what you have to offer, that's fabulous. And it's going to resonate and you will make a connection. If it turns out not to be what you have to offer, that's okay too, because chances are, especially if you've done your homework and you've networked with your peers, you're going to be a superstar in that person's eyes, because you're going to be able to say, I don't think what I have to offer is a good fit, but I do know somebody who has an offering that might be good for you. Would you like for me to make an introduction? Or can I give you their name and you can look into it for yourself? People will think just as highly of you, or even more highly of you, if you're sharing a resource with them that improves their lives. So to remember that it's a conversation, and that it's about listening, and it's about curiosity, and it's about, for the introvert entrepreneur, for any entrepreneur, it's a responsibility. Like, I have something to offer that can help ease someone else's pain. If I keep that to myself, if I don't share it, then I'm missing an opportunity and I'm not fulfilling my responsibility. I'm denying them of something, and I'm denying them the opportunity to say yes or no. I'm making up my mind for them.
I've been in situations a number of times where I've met with a potential client and realized that for whatever reason, it's maybe not quite the right fit, and have found a lot of value in, a lot of success in, admitting that and referring them elsewhere. And even though that may mean deferring some income or losing some income in the process, in the long run, I've always found that to be the right move when I'm honest about what I can do versus what they need.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, what can introverts learn about, Beth, celebrating wins? Why is that important?
We've probably heard the expression that building a business is a marathon, not a sprint. And a marathon can be kind of a thankless task because it goes on and on and on, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And you don't get to celebrate along the way unless you make a choice to say at each milestone, at each mile marker, I'm going to celebrate. And I think it's important for introverts to recognize that, yes, it's a marathon. And if you're going to stay motivated, if you're going to remember why you are doing what you're doing, it's important to acknowledge yourself. And that's one of my favorite questions to ask my clients, which is, what do you want to acknowledge yourself for? Because they can forget to say, oh yeah, to give myself credit and to say, oh yeah, I wouldn't have done it that way a year ago. And I'm proud of myself for doing that way. And we can often get so entrenched in what we're doing, and especially introverts, if we're internalizing it all, that we don't notice the progress that we're making. We aren't aware of the growth and evolution. So it's important to be able to step back every once in a while and be able to say, I don't have to wait until I cross the finish line to celebrate. I can acknowledge these little wins that go along the way. And to be able to externalize those wins, in those small wins, is a way of making those wins public that is not self-promotional. It's more about, I just finished this chapter in my book and I'm so excited. I want you to celebrate with me. It's not a braggy, look at me and how awesome I am. It's saying, I set a goal for myself and I met it. And I know that you, my supporters, are excited for me and want to see me succeed. So I want to share this with you. And that helps build community. It helps you to connect with people, and it helps you feel less alone as you're going and remembering, I am doing something really extraordinary here.
I found that to be very, very true. And like you, I've tried to be sure to point out sometimes specific individuals who have been a part of helping make it happen. And it becomes this joint celebration. It's not bragging. It's not, hey, look at me. It's more of, if anything else, hey, look at who helped me make this possible. Let's celebrate that kind of a thing.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons one of the chapters is called It Takes a Village, because you can't do it by yourself, as much as we would probably love to. We need the people around us, and celebrating those wins is definitely an opportunity to bring into consciousness and shine the light on other people who are part of your journey.
Well, I've jumped around a bit. I do want to ask some questions not directly related to the book, Beth, but before I do that, is there anything else you want to make sure we know about?
I think mainly that, my intention for the book is for the reader to find at least one idea or story that changes their perspective, or that helps them to understand and honor their introvert energy. I talk a lot about creating a sustainable business, because I think being a fake extrovert or not honoring your introvert energy is going to cause burnout. And so my hope is that I can help and support introvert entrepreneurs in building something that is going to be sustainable. So everything in the book is geared to that end. And my hope is, that you take away at least one thing that stays with you even years later. Because when I think about the books that have meant the most to me, sometimes it just boils down to one phrase or one quote, and that's a gift. So I hope that that other people find that gift for themselves in the book.
I wish more people read more, and that's one of the reasons why I do this podcast. And I always say, $20 is a pretty good investment. If you get one great idea from a book, that was well worth the $20.
Exactly. And if you think about hiring those folks for their wisdom, the $20 is pennies. Absolutely.
Well, I wouldn't let you go without talking about books. And I would love if you could name for us a couple of books that you've read in the past, or maybe books you're currently reading that have impacted you, and share, if you can, how or why they impacted you as they have, or as they did.
Yeah. Well, the first one I have to name is Please Understand Me by Kiersey and Bates. It was the first book that I picked up that had the definition of introvert in it. And once I found out my type, which is an INFJ, and I won't go into what all that means, but I trust that if anyone's curious, they can look it up and use Please Understand Me. It really explained a lot about myself, and I think was a real turning point in the journey. As I mentioned before, Good to Great has been a huge influence, even though it was published some 14 years ago. And I believe it's still in hardback. I don't know that it's gone to paperback yet, which is a kind of a testament to its evergreenness, even though I'm sure things have changed and maybe some of those great companies aren't so great anymore, who knows, but the principles of what he found and outlined, I have used constantly. I used them when I was working in the nonprofit sector, and I use them now. I find myself constantly referring back to them. When it comes to having that mind, body, spirit connection with my business and speaking to the heart of the part of me that wants to always approach my work from a place of compassion and grace. I love anything by Anne Lamott or Harold Kushner. They're both writers that really resonate with me and remind me about, really what's most important. And then from a business perspective, the last one I want to mention is another one I constantly come back to, which is Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. Yeah. I think every entrepreneur on the planet needs to read this book because it will transform the way you tell your story, the language you use, the way you frame things, and will make you, much more influential and much more able to move people. To touch their hearts and minds.
You mentioned several authors who we hope to have on the show someday.
Excellent.
Jim Collins being one of those. That book was very influential and had an impact on me back when it came out. It was one of those early books that kind of renewed my love for reading. I'd kind of left that part of my life behind, and reading was homework and a chore, and it was like, oh, good, I don't have to do that anymore because I'm not in school.
Yeah. And what's awesome about that book is, we started out talking about research and statistics, and it's very research and statistic oriented, and yet it tells a true story. It's written in a very accessible and sticky, to go back to Made to Stick, way. So it really is a shining example, I think, of how to combine those two worlds for a greater impact.
Another question I ask a lot of guests, and I definitely want to ask it of you, is related to giving a public talk. And I'd be curious to know what you see as some of the challenges for introverts in that area specifically, and maybe share some tips you have for delivering an impactful and memorable public talk, as I know you do a fair amount of that.
Yeah. I think the challenge for introverts is that if they think it's a challenge, that's mostly in their head, as it is for most people, that public speaking it can trigger that fight or flight response because it's very, we have a primal response to being one person in front of many because, back in the dark ages, that meant, okay, you were probably going to be chased and killed. And something in our brains remembers that. So it's natural to, feel a little bit of fear, feel, some discomfort and feel challenged by that. But I think for introverts, it's actually an extraordinary platform for them if they're able to claim it because it's one-to-many. It is an efficient way to communicate with a lot of people. One-to-one can be very exhausting. It's one reason I love the podcast because I can, have one conversation, post it, and reach a lot of people in a very efficient and effective manner and on their own terms. It allows us to prepare. Typically one hopes before you have to get up in front of a group of people that you've had a heads up. And we, as introverts, we don't have to fight for the floor. We've been given the floor. Right. It's an opportunity to be able to share what your message is without having to kind of jockey for a position among other people who are also trying to get their say in. So public speaking can really be a powerful tool in the introvert entrepreneur's toolbox. The thing that I want to remember most when I'm giving a talk is to meet people where they're at. It can be so tempting, especially if you're a research-loving introvert, to think that you have to tell the audience everything you know. Every cool fact, every quote, every story, every tip that you can squeeze in there. And instead, and I wish I could take credit for this, and I wish I could remember who to give credit to, but I remember reading somewhere that it's more important to tell them what they want to hear rather than what you want to tell them. Which requires you putting yourself in their shoes and saying, what is most important to this audience? What are they hoping that I share with them? And then focusing your message on that. And when I say focusing, I really do mean focusing. And just like, we learn in writing, there's that expression, I think it's kill your darlings. We get attached to phrases, stories, information, facts, statistics, all of those kinds of things. We fall in love with them. That's true in writing and it's true in presentations. And those are the prime places to look and say, is sharing that piece of information or that story in service to my audience? Or is it more about me feeling like I'm going to be clever or that I'm going to look good, right? So
right.
Who is this in service to? So that is one of the things that I think is most important, because people want to be seen and heard. So if you meet the audience where they're at, if you meet your listener where they're at, they are going to feel seen and heard. And therefore you're going to have a stronger connection with them naturally, because they're going to say, oh, this person gets me.
That's one of my challenges to a lot of podcasters I coach, particularly those doing interview-based podcasts, is oftentimes they want to talk as much as their guest does.
Yeah. And I have to admit, sometimes I feel like I can be guilty of that myself. It's so tempting, and I will hang up the phone, or I'll finish the podcast and I'll think, I talk too much. So it's awareness is the first step, right? Admitting it is the first step to recovery. And you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
And I have caught myself several times wanting to comment on things that you have said, and then sort of pausing in my mind and going, is that really to serve me or to make me look good, or is that really to serve the audience? And so I'll catch myself sometimes in interviews getting ready to go down that road.
Yeah. That principle applies in so many different situations.
Well, I want to ask too, to those whose lives you've been able to impact, which is a lot of people, and hopefully more after this interview, family, friends, colleagues, clients, at the end of the day, what do you hope to be remembered for the most?
That at some point we had a conversation or we had an interaction where they felt like they were seen and heard, where they felt like I held a mirror up to them and showed them their best self, reminded them of something good and powerful within them, and that made them feel like they could walk away feeling more empowered and compassionate with themselves, that they understand themselves a little bit better. Not because I imparted some sort of wisdom, but that I helped to reflect back something that was already in them that maybe they weren't seeing. That would, anytime that happens in coaching or in friendships or any relationship, it feels like it's the most important thing that can happen in that moment.
Well, remind me, Beth, of the official launch date. Is it early November?
It's November 3rd.
November 3rd, okay.
Election Day.
Election Day, yes.
Election Day, isn't that interesting?
And how long has it been complete? Or in other words, when did you turn it into your publisher officially?
December 17th, 2014. Okay. So a little less than a year ago.
Well, I asked that because I figured it had probably been a while. I think that's sometimes something that people don't realize. And so in light of that, I think it's fair to ask this question. What is next on the horizon?
One of the things that was important to me in writing this book is that it didn't just become, a dead tree sitting on a shelf collecting dust. I wanted it to be a living, breathing, or, evolving tool. So to that end, we're creating an online course that expands on each chapter. It picks up items that were left on the cutting room floor, which is an expression that probably someday is going to be obsolete, but there are enough around, enough of us that remember what that means. So, picking up the pieces that were, still valuable, but there wasn't quite room for, and being able to build community around it. It might seem like a contradictory thing to bring together introvert entrepreneurs and community, because don't we like our independence and to be alone? But at the same time, we find strength in connecting with other people who are experiencing the journey in a similar way, so we can learn from each other. So my intention with that online course is to expand and build on and update, a lot of the information that's in the book, as well as be a forum for bringing introvert entrepreneurs together. And I hope to, I'm planning some new presentations that are stemming out of the book, as well as looking forward to really growing and playing with the podcast, because it's just so much fun.
Well, I'm delighted to have had many, many former Read to Lead guests come out of the woodwork and say, Jeff, you have got to connect with Beth Belo. I'm so glad that I did. Beth, thank you for your time and for sharing with us your insights. We'll link up to, obviously, your book and all the other resources you referenced in the show notes and are happy to do so. And just wish nothing but the best for you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
I encourage you to reach out to Beth on Twitter. She's the Introvert Coach on Twitter. That's at Introvert Coach. I'll link to not only that, but also her LinkedIn profile, too, on the show notes page for today's episode, should you like to connect with Beth. That's also where you'll find the link to her book and all the other books and resources that Beth and I chatted about. The show notes page for today's episode can be found at readtoleadpodcast.com/102 for episode 102. When you find yourself in the market for your next desk, remember the folks at UpDesk. You can visit them at readtoleadpodcast.com/desk. I want to say a special thanks to Mike Chan, who has his own podcast launching soon. He's rated and reviewed the Read to Lead podcast in iTunes with 5 stars and calls it an awesome listen. Thank you, Mike. Also, James Carberry gives it 5 stars and calls it a really great show. Thank you so much, James. If you'd like to rate and review the podcast in iTunes, readtoleadpodcast.com/iTunes to do that. We appreciate it very much. It helps get the show noticed and recognized and in front of folks who might not have otherwise found it. You can also rate and review it on Stitcher, readtoleadpodcast.com/Stitcher. If you think it 5-star worthy, we'll mention you by name in an upcoming episode as a way to say thanks. Well, that's going to do it for this week. I look forward to seeing you next time for the Read to Lead podcast.
Thanks so much for listening to the Read to Lead podcast. As a subscriber, we challenge you to be more than just a passive listener. Become a vital member of the community. Visit us on the web at readtoleadpodcast.com. Until next time, remember, leaders read and readers lead.